Thank you, everyone, for being here. I count it a real privilege to be able to speak to you today, and that you would give a bit of your time during the workday when, if you're anything like me, you have had enough Zoom meetings and calls to last a lifetime. So thank you for that, and I'm looking forward to our time together, especially to your questions. As Jesus said, my wife is due with our second child on September 20th, but she really feels that he or she could come any day now. So if you do see me get up and sprint out of the room, at least you will know why. Today is a day where the date never goes by without me noticing. It's 9/11 today, and almost 20 years ago when those attacks happened, my father was working in downtown New York City. He would have taken the PATH train to right where the towers were and gotten out and walking to the New York Stock Exchange. They had a lockdown within the exchange initially. Then they allowed people to leave to try to get off of the island. My dad remembers walking out of the building with a colleague. The smoke and the carbon monoxide was too much for him. He turned around and went back to the building. His colleague continued, and his colleague didn't make it. My dad had nightmares about that day for many years from the things that he saw as he was in view of those buildings. A few months later, this was the same year actually that it was my first year at Princeton as an undergraduate, and a few months later I called home to my parents and I began the conversation with the words, "I'm a Christian now." And they didn't know what to do with that. We had grown up in a sort of culturally Christian home, but not a church-going home, not a practicing home. I didn't understand much about the Christian faith. Two soccer teammates of mine at Princeton had invited me along to a campus ministry. I didn't even know what a campus ministry was. All I knew was that Princeton had been my goal since the time I was very young. Princeton, for me, was this place of being the best, of being better than everyone else. And now I walk into this campus ministry, into this room, and all of a sudden I see all of these peers of mine at Princeton, supposed to be achievers, intelligent, successful, and they are singing their hearts out, praising someone else for being better than them. And it really jarred my whole thinking about what life was about. That was the beginning of a journey of being part of that community, of asking some very difficult questions as I was studying philosophy, of allowing God to work on my heart for the first time in my life. And eventually I dropped to my knees in my dorm room. It was 122 Jolene Hall. I exclaimed out loud, although there was no one there. I said, "Oh my gosh, this really happened." And I told Jesus that I wanted to trust him with my life. But now it really scared my parents. And they had this fear that came over them as I told them this news and then in the coming weeks. And I couldn't at the time understand why that was the case. I was saying to them, "Look, I'm treating you better now as my parents. I'm treating my brother better. Why can't we all just be happy about this?" But I think that for my parents now, as I look back on that time, it being so shortly after 9/11 and their perspective on what had occurred at 9/11, I think part of what was going on was that they were scared of me having this newfound, serious, strong, life-changing conviction about transcendent truth. They were scared because I think subconsciously in their minds, they had come to believe that the trajectory of truth was from a serious conviction about truth to then that necessarily leading to disagreement, then disagreement necessarily leading to devaluing the people that you disagree with. And then from devaluing to intolerance, to extremism, to violence, and ultimately to terrorism. And if that is the trajectory of truth, if truth starts you down a path that ends in devaluing intolerance, violence, terrorism, then you do have reason to fear truth. Then truth is an act of war. And an act of war only leaves you with two options. Either you fight or you flee. Either you fight for truth, you come to the determination that truth is more important than love, and so you focus all of your attention on truth and you fight for truth by whatever means necessary, and if others have to get hurt in the process, so be it. Or alternatively, you come to the determination that love is more important than truth. And then in that case, you flee from truth altogether. You wind up embracing a form of pluralism, a form of believing that all beliefs are equally valid, which is philosophically incoherent. A colleague of mine a while back at a secular university campus had a student come up to him and said, "I don't think it is my place to disagree with anyone." My colleague said, "Sure you do." He said, "No, I don't." My colleague said, "You just did." That's how quickly that form of pluralism dissolves philosophically. But if truth is an act of war, if choosing truth over love means that you wind up on this trajectory, on this path that ends in violence and extremism, well, maybe philosophical incoherence is a price worth paying. Maybe we just don't want to go there. And so I think that this is part of what was going on in my parents' mind as they processed my conversion. But that we are, as a society, I think we are given this cultural ultimatum between love and truth. Either you disavow truth altogether, or you go to war for truth and you destroy anything or anyone that's in your way in the process. Jesus refused to make that choice. That is one of the things that I love about him. And I think there's a deeply theological reason for that, because the scriptures tell us, the Bible tells us, that God is love. 1 John 4. The Bible also tells us that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. So God is love and God is truth. And if that's the case, then by transitivity of identity, in the person of Jesus, truth equals love. You have love and truth perfectly united in the person of Jesus, who is metaphysically in himself both love and truth. Jesus does not allow us to separate the two or to make a choice between the two. They always have to be held together. And so in this culture that I think so often demands of us an ultimatum between either love or truth, Christianity refuses to choose, because in the person of Jesus, love and truth are one and the same. And I think that what follows from that is a model for disagreement. And I hope this is relevant to your own context, but a model for disagreement which is very countercultural and I think desperately needed. Jesus did disagree with us. Okay, Jesus' very coming was an act of disagreement with us. It was an act of saying that he disagreed with the lives that we were living. They had disagreed so much with what he had intended for them that he had to come and save us. His very coming was an act of disagreement. And yet, Jesus' coming was also his most extravagant act of love for us. You see, Jesus cut the link in that trajectory of truth. He cut the link between disagreement and devaluing, because his expression of truth was one and the same as his expression of love. He did not allow disagreement to lead to the devaluing of the other. Not truth that is more important than love, not love that is more important than truth, but love and truth perfectly united in a personal sacrifice. And I think that is the model of disagreement that we are called to as Christians. And so the first question I just want to raise for us today is, what would that look like? What would that look like with the person you disagree with most politically? What would that look like to communicate your disagreement through an act of radical love and personal sacrifice? Now, I don't suppose to think that that's going to be an easy question to answer, because I don't think it was an easy question for Jesus to answer. It was an answer to the question that meant Jesus had to sweat and bleed for us and come and ultimately give his life on a cross. There's not an easy answer to that question. It requires creativity, prayerfulness, courage, certainly humility. But I think that that is the question that Jesus figured out how to answer for us. How could he communicate truth to us in a way that would actually be heard? Why? because it was not the communication of truth and then a loving act later to compensate for the violence of the truth. No, it was the communication of truth in and through the same act of radical love and personal sacrifice. That's the question that Jesus figured out how to answer for us, and I believe that our communities and our nations will live in strife until we can figure out how to answer that question for one another. So I'm going to leave that question with you for now. I want to dig a bit further into this societal fear of truth and go one level down with it conceptually. When you fear truth, I think two other things result from that. And we're seeing both of these things in a big way in Western culture at the moment. The first thing I'm going to talk about is a culture of offense. Being afraid of truth, it leads to a sensitivity about being offended, because even disagreement itself becomes offensive. Because remember that truth leads to disagreement, but as soon as we get there, we think the trajectory has to be devaluing intolerance, extremism, violence, and terrorism. If that's the case, disagreement itself is offensive. And so we have this sensitivity to offense. And it used to be that being tolerant of another person's belief, if they disagreed with you, was enough. That was seen as a virtue. Whereas very often nowadays, being tolerant of someone else's belief is not enough. You may actually have to affirm the other person's belief in order not to be seen as someone who is hateful. That's a shift that we've seen. And increasingly, I think that we do live in a culture that is offended by a lot. I was reading in an article in a paper not long ago. This is just a funny, silly example, but a new game called Monopoly for Millennials. And millennials were very upset by this game because some of the stops along the way included stopping at a vegetarian bistro and then on your friend's couch and a number of other places. Okay, there was a offense taken because of the game, and maybe there's something offensive in that. But there are much more serious examples as well. This is another one that I came across a number of months ago. An internal memo was circulated to Facebook employees not that long ago, and there was new rules for, quote, open and respectful communication at work. And then among those rules included, don't try to change someone's politics or religion. And then the memo continues, these guidelines apply to all work communications, including workplace email, chat, tasks, posters, whiteboards, chalkboards, and face-to-face. And they were challenged on the policy. Facebook defended the policy. They said it aimed to ensure that internal communication is respectful. I found that problematic because it seemed to imply that the logical implication in the memo is that if you try to persuade someone to change either their political beliefs or their religious beliefs, that is inherently disrespectful. Now, as a Christian who believes that I've been instructed to go and make disciples of all nations, I find that seriously problematic. And then as I think of all of you guys have a double problem. If you're both Christians who have been instructed as I have been, but also if you are called specifically to the political realm and to having deep convictions in the political realm and to persuading others of the legitimacy of those convictions as well. So a culture of offense. Second feature of culture, this is the last one that I want to say something about, is a culture of unforgiveness. Fear of truth leads to sensitivity to offense. And then that leads, I believe, to a culture of unforgiveness. Why? Because it is the nature of forgiveness to make yourself vulnerable to being offended again. When Peter asked Jesus, how many times should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7? And Jesus responds, 77. The remarkable thing about that response is Jesus is saying if somebody has sinned against you and wronged you 76 times, you still should be close enough to that person, in enough of relationship with that person that they could actually offend you the 77th time. That's quite a challenging response from Jesus. And I think today's culture is actually the polar opposite of Jesus' command, because nowadays, the moment offense takes place, there is no possibility of forgiveness. As soon as offense takes place, forgiveness is already off the table. It used to be the case that we would say, confess your sins and leniency will be shown. It used to be that confession was seen as a virtue that then resulted in leniency. But nowadays, if a leader falls publicly and you want to get as many retweets as you possibly can on Twitter, what is the word that you're going to use? Unforgivable. That's the word that's going to get the most retweets. It'll be lauded. No one will think that there's a problem in identifying something as unforgivable and a person as completely canceled and no longer worth listening to. And here's why I think this is so dangerous. Because if you can't be forgiven, as soon as forgiven is taken off of the table in a culture, as soon as you cannot be forgiven, you cannot tell the truth about yourself. Because for every one of us, there is good in us, but there's also evil in us. And as soon as you cannot be forgiven for the evil within you, you cannot tell the truth about yourself. And that means that you cannot be fully known. And if you cannot be fully known, then you cannot be fully loved. And if you cannot be loved, then you're going to wind up lonely. And if you're lonely, that's going to lead to anxiety. And that's going to lead to depression. And that's going to lead to anger. And statistically, all of those things are on the rise. And suicide is going to be in that package of emotions, and the statistics on suicide are on the rise as well. And so I think what we're left with in society is this offensiveness-forgiveness gap. The health of any society, I believe, is measured by the gap between the amount of perceived offense and then the amount of offered forgiveness. If you have a lot of offense in society, but you also have a lot of forgiveness, relationships can be maintained. If you don't have that much forgiveness, but you also don't have that much offense, relationships can be maintained. But when you have a lot of perceived offense and very little forgiveness, when the gap between those two things is wide, that is when you are really headed for unhealthiness in society or in any relationship. And I'm not sure that that gap has ever been wider than it is right now. And social media is exponentially multiplying that gap because it is so much easier to offend over social media than it is to actually go through the process of reconciliation. Okay, a tweet for a tweet is so much less costly than an eye for an eye. You can offend back and forth. And an offense from distance, if I offend you by yelling at you across the street, that could be pretty effective. But reconciliation from distance, that is not effective. That requires the intimacy and the vulnerability of being up close and personal, of being face to face. And I think the result is that we may be living with more unreconciled hurt, not necessarily worse, but more unreconciled hurt than at any time in history. Now, I've painted a pretty bleak portrait of contemporary culture. As I start to move towards a finish, I want to switch that around a little bit, because one of the things I love about Jesus is that he tended to look for what was good and what was right in front of him before he just focused on what was bad and what was wrong. And you see that in a number of different places. I think of, should we pay taxes to Caesar? They were trying to trick him, trying to trap him. There was nothing positive about that question. Jesus still thought, you know what, I can do something with this question. It's a question about belongingness. Give me that coin. Who does it belong to? Whose image is on it? They were amazed. They walked away. They should have stayed. The founder of our organization, Ravi, said if they had stayed, Jesus' next question would have been, whose image is on you? Even in a question that was meant to trap and be evil, he found something good. Beautiful story of the woman at the well in John 4. When you read through that passage, look at how Jesus does this time and time again. She's trying to pick a fight. We worship on this mountain. You say we have to worship in Jerusalem. Jesus could have gotten into the debate. Instead, he said, let me find some sort of point of agreement. Okay, well, I sort of see what you're saying. You want to know why? Because one day there's going to be a day where we're not going to worship on this mountain or in Jerusalem. We're going to worship in spirit and in truth. He tried to find the good and the positive, and it's so easy to see the negative and the frustrating in people and in culture. It takes more effort to see the good, but it's what Jesus did, and I think it's worth it. And so I just want to, as I close, take a step back and summarize what culture is saying, what I've already been through, a culture of offense and a culture of unforgiveness. Here's a way of summarizing what culture is saying. One, it's saying that we are more offensive than we think. That's the culture of offense. And then the second thing which culture is saying is that apart from God, which is, of course, the assumption of secular culture, apart from God, forgiveness is not possible. We are more offensive than we think, and apart from God, forgiveness is not possible. Well, that's half the gospel. Even in all my frustrations with culture, I can find some positives in there. I can build on that. We are more offensive than we think. Absolutely, that's gospel truth. All have sinned and fallen short. No one is righteous, not even one. And apart from God, forgiveness is not possible. That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. And why we look to Jesus. Without God, how could justice possibly be served? Even now, globally around the world, as we think about historical, grave evils and crimes, how no words could be strong enough, no actions could be sufficient to find justice for what we're dealing with, unless there is someone who served justice on our behalf in the most extraordinary and unconditional of ways. I was really convicted a few months ago about how differently I treat people and culture. When I see a person in front of me, an actual specific individual, I try to find common ground. I try to find something positive. I try to build a bridge to that person. But when I start talking about culture, all of a sudden I always look for the negatives first. I want to counter culture. I want to go to war against culture. I don't want anything about secular culture to get over to me and my family and my business and corrupt the things that are valuable to me. But of course, culture is just people in community. And it is very hard to love a person well and to be unqualifiedly negative about their culture. I believe the gospel is waiting to be found in our contemporary culture because through all of the mess, through all of the falsehoods, through all of the frustrations, right now, there are statements being made that we have underestimated our offense, and that apart from God, the assumption of a secular culture, we're struggling to find a way to forgive. Well, that right there are some significant components of the gospel. How can we take that and build a bridge? And I'll just leave you with one final challenge. If I were to try and take all of this conceptual stuff and say, how can we make it very, very practical? I would ask you the question, when is the last time you said, will you forgive me? I think it's the most powerful question at our disposal. Because one of my best friends last year, he was struck by anxiety. Came out of nowhere. I flew up to spend a week with him and a counselor. In the first day of that counseling, it became apparent that he and his wife had wronged each other 12 years prior and never dealt with it. It had just been swept under the carpet. And on that first day, this counselor, Christian counselor, taught my friend for the first time what it looked like to actually repent of having done something wrong and take ownership of that, and then to ask that actual question, will you forgive me? Not to make a statement, I'm sorry, which doesn't require the vulnerability. It doesn't require actually sitting there uncomfortably and needing a response from the other, but to ask the question, will you forgive me? And my friend did that of his wife, and there was this weight on his shoulders as he waited. And then she said, yes, I will. And then we were about to move on, and she jumped back in and she said, can I ask for forgiveness for something too? We said, of course. And then they did that in the reverse. And each time when forgiveness was granted, they instinctively lunged towards each other and embraced. And then my friend, who I had been sharing the gospel with for decades, turned to me and said, is this what you mean when you talk about reconciling with God? I had been talking to him about it for years and years, but now he had actually seen it. And one of the things that Jesus teaches us is that so often we need to see something in the flesh before we are willing to accept it in our minds and in our hearts. And my friend had seen forgiveness take place concretely, horizontally on the human level, and then he understood what it meant vertically to be forgiven by God and reconciled with God. So when is the last time you asked the question, will you forgive me? Of a family member, of a spouse, of a friend, of a child, of a colleague, of your boss, of your assistant, of a person that you disagree with politically as much as you possibly can. The more we are willing to humble ourselves and ask that question and actually, as the Bible says, be God's ambassadors in the ministry of reconciliation, people will see that concretely in the flesh, and then they will know something of what reconciliation with God looks like as well. So very practically, as we try to figure out, as we live in this culture of offense and all of the offense that we're now recognizing, good, and all of the lack of forgiveness, because we can't figure out a way to forgive, can we as Christians be the ones who model that by taking the first step, by asking for forgiveness ourselves and actually experiencing it concretely, have a friend or a colleague experience forgiveness enacted, something they may have never experienced in their entire life, and then all of a sudden, as God makes his appeal through you, understand what the gospel means to be reconciled with God. That's the vision that I have about how we can intersect with this culture in a way that brings the gospel and honors God. I hope that's an encouragement to all of you. Thank you for listening to me, and I really look forward to your questions.